Hello, my name is Rebecca Erbelding, and I'm a historian at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. I specialize in looking at American responses to the Holocaust. A few days ago, on November 9th, 2022, I was in Overland Park, Kansas at the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education, and I participated in their annual commemoration of the Kristallnacht pogrom. We forgot to hit record on the discussion and on the presentation that I gave. And so now I am back in Washington, D.C. in my home office, and I'm going to share with you some of the things that I shared with the audience that night in Kansas. I'm going to share my screen now. And because we're not going to be able to do the question and answer period, I've added my email address here to the bottom of the screen. If you have any questions about this presentation or about the history, you can certainly either contact the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education or you can email me at this address below. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how Americans responded to the Kristallnacht pogrom, what information they knew, and what they did about what they were learning. But before I can get to 1938, which is when Kristallnacht happened, I have to go back to 1933 and how Americans responded to the early days of the Nazi regime in 1933, the beginning of the persecution of German Jews. Kristallnacht did not come out of a vacuum for Americans, and while it was certainly shocking to them, it was not necessarily surprising to them. And to understand that, we need to look back. So Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany on January 30th, 1933, only 6 weeks before Franklin Roosevelt was inaugurated as the 32nd President of the United States. And even in the crowded news of March 1933, the presidential inauguration, the beginning of the first 100 days, the end of prohibition and the beginning of beer sales in the United States, the closures of the banks, often headline news would be what was happening in Germany. You can see here the March 1st, 1933 Atlanta Constitution reading "Arms rule Germany as Hitler smashes at Reds." The Deseret News in Salt Lake City had Hitler threatens reprisals on Jews. And they include a picture as a sample of Nazi tyranny, supposedly of a German Jew who's being forced to march through the streets with a sign that says that he will never again complain to the police about how he's being treated. The Kansas City Star presents a photo spread on March 20th, 1933, with the headline, "A Terror Sweeps Germany, with the nation in the grip of Hitler's militant National Socialists." And we know that Americans are reading this information from all over the country, from at least 29 of the 48 states. And from over 500 organizations, there are petitions pouring into Washington to people's senators and congressmen, to the State Department, and directly to the White House. Many of these petitions are from Jewish organizations, but some are not. The one on the left that you can see is from the Citizens of Douglas, Arizona. The Socialist Party of Maine sends one. The Detroit Painters Union Local 42 sends one. The Irish American Voters League, certainly not a Jewish organization, they send a petition. The Detroit Jewish Chronicle, a Jewish newspaper in Michigan, sends a stack of signatures. You can see one of the pages on the right, protesting the Nazi persecution of Jews. Some of the petitions are from new organizations that are created specifically to address what is happening in Germany. The Los Angeles Citizens Committee for Justice to Jews in Germany, the New London, Connecticut Committee on Protest, the New York Committee Against German Fascist Atrocities. And a lot of these petitions call on Roosevelt or call on the State Department to publicly condemn what they call the Nazi molestation of Jews through some sort of formal protest to the German government. Here is a report of an interfaith rally in Cleveland, where you can see that it was attended by over 10,000 people. There was a non-sectarian, so an interfaith meeting in Baltimore where they printed programs, and a petition after a mass meeting of Protestants, Catholics, and Jews held at the Episcopal Cathedral in St. Louis, where the bishop says a great throng of people crowded the cathedral. Here's part of the resolution that they sent. Second, it is not for us to interfere in the political affairs of the German nation, but there is no denying that today the consequences of pronounced disturbances in any great country have to be reckoned with throughout the civilized world. We therefore feel it our duty to express our moral indignation regarding the reported excesses against the Jews in Germany. At a rally in Madison Square Garden on March 27th, 55,000 people showed up, 20,000 inside the garden and another 35,000 who stood outside listening to speech after speech from the governor, from a senator, from an interfaith group, from the head of the American Federation of Labor. The New York Times reported that more than 1 million people nationwide at some point participated in a protest or signed a petition, either in New York or in their local communities. And as you could tell, all of this outcry is putting pressure on the Roosevelt administration, particularly the State Department, to do something about this. They are hesitant to issue any sort of formal protest against the Nazis. One official wrote that the State Department was, quote, of the opinion that outside intercession has rarely produced the results desired and has frequently aggravated the situation. So the State Department first is getting its feet under it. You know, the Roosevelt administration is newly in power. There is no US ambassador in Germany who's reporting back what he's seeing. And they are nervous that if the US protests, the Nazis will make things worse for Jews in Germany. And that is a very real fear that people had. American reporting was so good at this point, and the Nazis' aims were so clear that often American newspapers were reporting on new laws and anti-Semitic events in Germany in advance of them actually happening. So take a look at this Dallas Morning News issue from March 29th, 1933. You can see the headline, Nazi chiefs order Jewish boycott, even school children are included. This is 3 days before the planned Nazi boycott of Jewish-owned businesses throughout Germany, which is going to take place on April 1st. So you can be in Dallas, Texas, and know that in 3 days, the Nazis are going to boycott Jewish-owned stores. The Nazis are also watching this protest movement in the United States, and they decide to use it to their advantage. So they begin to blame their anti-Semitism on this international outcry, saying that Germany is now under attack, that all of these protesters are attacking Germany, that the atrocity stories that people are reading in their newspapers are false, that they are placed in newspapers by Jews who own the media. And so therefore they're, of course, reinforcing an anti-Semitic stereotype and unleashing it. And so when the boycott happens, on April 1st, 1933, you can see that there are even signs in Germany in English. And this is for the British and the American journalists to photograph. And it says that the Nazis are blaming the boycott on Jewish atrocity propaganda, meaning all of these newspaper articles that are reporting on what Germans and the Nazis are doing. The German embassy, the US embassy in Berlin reports that the boycott went off like a holiday, that most Jewish stores or stores that were owned by Jews just didn't even try to open that day, that only one person was killed. And by April 4th, the Nazis decide that they're not going to continue the boycott, that in their eyes, the foreign protests had been checked. And don't forget that Nazi anti-Semitism is reinforced either way. Their ideas of this world Jewish domination, it's being reinforced no matter how the Americans react. So if the protests and the negative news, which of course was true, continues in the United States, that's a sign that Jews own the media and that they're being defiant. If it stops, if there are no more newspaper articles, if the protests die down, that is a sign that Jews own the media and that Americans are scared. And so either way, and this is true of anti-Semitism generally, it's not logical. You can get your beliefs, these false beliefs that are based in hate, reinforced no matter what. American protests did continue. There was this protest in New York, which was the largest the largest protest march in New York City history up to this point. And this one in Chicago This was timed to book burning in Germany on May 10th, 1933, which was another event that Americans could read about in advance of it actually happening. But after that, there weren't these big visual events in Germany for a while. And the issue started to fall off the front pages. And so Americans refocus. This is still the time of the Great Depression. About 25% of the American workforce was unemployed. And so when Americans are no longer reading these big front headline stories about what was happening in Germany, they start to focus on what is happening here, on the next crisis, and on the crises that are happening in the United States. And Americans begin and continue to double and triple down on the ideas of isolation and neutrality. Let's get to Kristallnacht now. In March 1938, Germany annexed Austria. So hundreds of thousands of people, mostly Jewish, were now sitting on waiting lists to immigrate to the United States. President Roosevelt calls an international conference to try to deal with these refugees, saying this is an international problem, it needs an international solution, and the conference is a complete failure. In September, after Britain and France agree to appease Hitler rather than risk war, Germany then takes over the Sudetenland, part of Czechoslovakia. So the situation in Europe is getting grim. Germany is continuing to be territorially aggressive. It doesn't look like people are checking him. And Americans are determined to stay out of all of this. And we know that because the mid-1930s was the moment when George Gallup starts setting up his public opinion polling operation. So we don't have a lot of public opinion polling in 1933, but we do by 1938. And you can see that in September 1938, most Americans, 62% of them, do not want President Franklin Roosevelt to openly criticize Hitler and Mussolini for their warlike attitudes. The following month, in October, 59% of Americans think that England and France did the right thing in giving in to Germany instead of going to war. So I think it's very comforting for us to look back and pretend that Americans weren't anti-Nazi. Or Americans were anti-Nazi, and they were. Most Americans did not like the Germans. Most Americans were against Hitler and what he was doing, but they were not concerned enough to want to risk any sort of conflict over what the Nazis were. So on November 9th and 10th, 1938, in response to the assassination of a minor German diplomat in Paris, the Nazis unleashed a coordinated terror campaign throughout Germany and all of the areas that Germany controlled, so now Austria and the Sudetenland. Hundreds of synagogues were burned. About 30,000 Jewish men and boys were arrested and sent to concentration camps. Kristallnacht resulted in the longest sustained newspaper coverage of any event related to the persecution of Jews. It was front page news in the United States for weeks afterwards. So you can see this headline from the Lincoln Star in Lincoln, Nebraska. This is November 10th, 1938. You can see the big headline is Synagogues Destroyed by Nazis. But look at what else is happening that day. So the president of and founder of modern Turkey has just died. Pearl Buck is the winner of the Nobel Prize. And this is only 2 days after the midterm elections. So you can see elections at a glance. Both parties look forward to the 1940 battle. This was an election in which the Roosevelt administration and the Democrats had taken a beating. They had lost about 85 seats in the House of Representatives. This is a major defeat for the Nazis, for the Roosevelt administration. And yet the headline is about Kristallnacht. On November 10th, the day after this, a new song would debut on the radio, sung by famed singer Kate Smith. So we all know the song, God Bless America. It has a first verse that we don't sing anymore. And the first verse went like this. While the storm clouds gather far across the sea, let us swear allegiance to a land that's free. Let us all be grateful that we're far from there as we raise our voice in solemn prayer. And as I said, Kristallnacht was front page news throughout the country. Here's the Hutchinson News of Kansas, Paris assassination likely to ruin every Jew in Germany. The Kansas City Star made their headline, Nazi hate burns, with the subheadline, Fear a Get Out Order, referencing the fear that many Jews rightfully had that they were about to be kicked out of Germany. Some Americans were inside Germany, witnessing the destruction in person. The Holocaust Museum's collection includes the diary of Robert Harlan, who was a student from the University of Chicago who spent a study abroad year in Germany in 1938 and 1939. He was studying at the University of Marburg. And before he left Chicago, he had befriended a man named William Stern, who was likewise a student. Stern was German and Jewish, and said, you're going to Germany, go see my parents, they'll feed you, they'll put you up, it'll be good for you to know somebody when you get there. And Robert Harlan does. He goes and he stays with the Sterns for a little bit as soon as he arrives in Germany before he starts his classes. And so on November 11th, Robert gets this desperate call from Frida Stern, from his friend's mom. And he writes, quote, "So here I am on the outskirts of Frankfurt, sitting in a train and bound for Würzburg, where I know not what awaits me. This might be classified under adventure, but an adventure arising from such despicable, horrible, and unhuman sources. America, the land of the free, still has much meaning, I'm thinking." When he arrives at the Sterns, he discovers that Dr. Stern, his friend's father, had been arrested. And you can see that Robert's handwriting changes. It becomes staccato. He's doing stream of consciousness. Little left in one piece, doors smashed, furniture splintered to nothing, pictures methodically mutilated, books scattered all over, clock turned over, mirrors shattered systematically. So he spends the next several days helping Mrs. Stern clean up, making sure that she is cared for. And then he spends the next couple of weeks and months while he is at school trying to help the Sterns navigate the immigration system so that they can immigrate to the United States. And the Sterns got lucky. They had family in the US, and so they were able to get out to London and from there to the United States. They arrived in March 1939, obviously, again, very lucky to have people who could help them. Robert later served in the US military, and this is a post-war photo of him with the Sterns in Pennsylvania. So back to the United States for a minute. In the wake of Kristallnacht, President Roosevelt did a couple of things. First, he followed a suggestion from his Secretary of Labor, Francis Perkins, who urged the president to grant people who were in the United States on tourist visas, Germans who were in the US, who did not feel safe going home, to allow them to remain. Roosevelt could not unilaterally grant them immigration visas, but he could safely extend the expiration of their tourist visas. So we believe that between 12 and 15,000 Germans, mostly German Jews, who were visiting the United States as tourists to meet with family, to find jobs, to find housing, to kind of set themselves up to go back to Germany and then apply for permanent immigration, allowed them to stay. And the president made it clear that he was not going to let these people be in limbo. He was going to continue to extend their expirations until it was safe for them to go home. Roosevelt also requested the US ambassador to Germany, Hugh Wilson, to come home for consultation. This was not a formal withdrawal, but it effectively was. The United States did not have an ambassador in Germany again until after World War II. And you can see that the Nazis understood this as a withdrawal, as an attack on what they had done. So Nazis angrily assail US act. And I like this cartoon here too. You can see it's called Scat, and it shows that the Nazi press attack has left something on the shoe of Uncle Sam. And so you can see that it's very clear that people are understanding that the Nazis are quite that they're attacking, that this attack is unfair, and that it is tantamount to scat, I will say. So I'm showing you this picture now so you can see some of the signs. This is a post-Kristallnacht protest organized by a Jewish community in Los Angeles. And so you can see united against fascism, Nazi Germany has no place among the civilized nations, we greet our president for his denunciation of the Nazis, feed the refugees. There were a few protests like this throughout the country after Kristallnacht, but nothing like what we saw in 1933. So despite all of the headlines after the Kristallnacht pogrom, you don't see the same outcry, the same rallies, the same petitions, and the same protest marches in 1938 as you did in the early months of the Nazi regime in 1933. And these polls might help us understand why. They were both conducted in late November 1938, and the same people answered both questions. So for the first, do you approve or disapprove of the Nazi treatment of Jews in Germany? 94% of Americans disapprove of what the Nazis are doing. And then the same people are asked, should we allow a larger number of Jewish exiles from Germany to come to the United States to live? And 72% of those polled say no. And my theory is that that's why you don't see the public outcry in 1938. In 1933, the rallies and the marches and the petitions were for the Nazis to stop over there. By 1938, it is clear that the Nazis are not stopping. In fact, they are ramping up their attacks. And so the idea of getting them to stop doesn't make any sense. And so the next logical thing that the United States could do is it could open up immigration. And that was something that Americans were not willing to protest and to petition and to pressure their government to do. And hundreds of thousands of people were on the waiting lists to immigrate to the United States. The 1924 Johnson-Reed Immigration Act structured the US immigration process, and it set up quotas, limits of the number of people who could come from each country each year based on somebody's national origins. So our immigration law, which was not changed in the 1930s or 40s to address the Jewish refugee crisis, it had been designed in the 1920s to keep America a white Protestant nation. The United States also had no refugee provisions. So you couldn't come as a refugee, you couldn't come as an asylum seeker, you couldn't come as a migrant either. So while we use the term Jewish refugee, it actually had no meaning in law. People fleeing persecution had to gather the same documents. You can see some examples of those documents here, as people who are immigrating to join family or to seek economic opportunities. In fact, so many people were applying to come to the United States, and immigration was so difficult, the process was so difficult, that there were years-long waiting lists. You can see the quota demand here for a couple of countries for January 1st, 1939. And on January 1st, there are 240,000 people born in Germany or Austria who are on the waiting list. And the yearly quota, the limit of the number of people who can come who were born in Germany and Austria, is 27,370. So there are 9 years worth of immigration applicants waiting on the waiting list. While the US didn't keep track of how many of those people were Jewish, we know anecdotally that more than 90% of them were. There were a few ways to get around the immigration quotas and leave the waiting list. And I want to talk about one of them now. So far, our story has been pretty disappointing. I always want the United States to open our doors to immigrants in the wake of Kristallnacht, and that doesn't happen. But there are inspiring stories, and so I think it's worth focusing on one of them. Kristallnacht and the refugee crisis had an impact on hundreds of college campuses nationwide, and a movement quickly sprung up to try to help student refugees. One of the ways around the immigration process was to obtain a student visa. And so for college-age refugees who were able to get spots at universities, a student visa would allow them to skip the immigration waiting line and travel immediately. Their stay was technically temporary, only as long as they were a student, but that is still 4 years, and that is 4 years of not being in Europe. And so a lot of people were interested in this loophole. In late 1938, a group of students at Harvard and Radcliffe organized the Harvard Committee to Aid German Student Refugees. And working through the International Student Service, they coordinated with campuses nationwide to help other student groups navigate, to find the right people, the right organizations, to fill out the right paperwork, to enable refugee students to come to their universities. Often this meant fundraising for scholarship money, since administrations were only willing to give a slot to a refugee student if that person's tuition would be covered in some way. and most potential refugees did not have the money to cover their own tuition. By April 1939, the Student Peace Service, which was a wing of the American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers, reported that, quote, American colleges have responded wholeheartedly to the needs of refugee students in Europe. This really was a massive campaign. The Holocaust Museum has identified at least 183 colleges and universities that tried to sponsor refugee students. In the local Kansas area, this included the University of Kansas, the College of the Ozarks, William Jewell College tried to sponsor a refugee. And to give you an individual example, this is Tom Deppner. So Tom grew up in Germany. He had a Christian father and a Jewish mother, so he was considered mixed race by the Nazis. He had been involved in a Quaker youth group in Berlin, although he was not a practicing Quaker himself. And so when he had to flee, he reached out to the American Friends Service Committee, the American Quakers, to see if they could help him find a college in the United States that would accept him so that he could escape Europe. The American Quakers were the largest non-Jewish aid organization assisting individual refugees like Tom and like families who were trying to find American financial sponsors or ship tickets or that sort of thing. And so the Holocaust Museum has about 20,000 case files that were used by the Quakers to keep track of all of the different cases that they were working on. And so that's where we found a lot of Tom's story. His case file includes letters from Georgia Tech, from the University of Illinois, and from Rutgers. It also includes a letter from the Quakers to Tom explaining that he has, at this point, Tom has made it to the Netherlands, but Tom has also been chosen as the first alternate in a scholarship contest that Oberlin College was running, and that if the winner of the contest physically couldn't escape Europe, Tom would be given that slot. McPherson College, a small Christian school in McPherson, Kansas, with only about 200 students, was also raising money to admit a refugee student. Here is their college paper. I really love some of the wording in here. You can see next to the title of the paper, Help Make Hitler's Loss Our Gain. Students at McPherson are called McCampusons. So Hitler is pitching, the McCampusons are catching a refugee. Students plan to secure non-Aryan to come here. Non-Aryan was a term that was generally used for people who the Nazis considered to be Jewish under the Nuremberg laws, but someone who did not consider themselves to be Jewish, who did not practice the Jewish religion. So the article is a little weird. It says that students will have the privilege of, quote, having as their constant companion a student who is aware of the European situation and Hitler's purge. And it says that a Christian student can be secured, that local students can choose from a long list the student that they desire, that sex, age, and even looks can enter into the choice of who they wanted to come to McPherson. And of course, this doesn't make any sense. There isn't like a lookbook or a yearbook where people could look and pick the refugee that they wanted. But all spring, the students at McPherson are holding fundraisers and raising money to get tuition so that they can bring a refugee student. An American Quaker who is working at a refugee hostel in Scattergood, Iowa, knew Tom from their days in the youth group in Berlin. And so when he found out that Tom was looking for a slot, he got in touch with McPherson and said, I think I have somebody who would really work well. And he recommended Tom to be the recipient of this slot. On July 20th, 1939, somebody from McPherson wrote to the Quakers to let them know that they were ready to admit Tom, as long as he was able to accept a few conditions. First, McPherson attempts to maintain the standards and ideals of the church on its campus. Smoking, drinking, and dancing are not permitted. If Mr. Deppner should decide to come, he would be expected to conform to the ideals of the college. Tom apparently agreed, because on August 13th, he sent the AFSC a telegram with the single word, accepted. He sent a letter too, which he says, I don't smoke and drink, and I don't want to dance. I just want to be in the United States and study there. But Tom still has to get to the United States, and American consular officials in the Netherlands are so overwhelmed that it might take months to get that paperwork through to secure his student visa. And 2 weeks after Tom writes this letter, war breaks out in Europe. McPherson is understanding about all of this, but they can only hold that slot and that tuition money for so long. There is a point in the college semester where it is too late to enroll. And actually, there's a separate case file at the museum for a Czech student who arrived in the United States thinking that he had secured a student slot, only to learn that by the time he arrived, the school had given away his slot. And he is held at Ellis Island for several months as the Quakers frantically try to find some other school who could take this kid who is already in the United States. Tom ultimately misses the fall of 1939 semester, but he does make it to Kansas. He attends McPherson. He majors in mathematics. He was named the president of the Foreign Affairs Club. And after graduation, he served in the U.S. Army. He actually served in the Army for the entirety of his career. He went back to Germany as a member of the U.S. occupying forces. So in closing, Americans responded to Kristallnacht in a lot of different ways, but mostly by not responding specifically. Unlike in 1933, there weren't massive protests. There was massive coverage, but by the late 1930s, Americans were much more concerned about the possibility of war and not wanting to get involved, wanting to stay isolated and neutral. And that was on a bipartisan, overwhelming basis. They were also not willing or open to accepting more immigrants, particularly if the immigrants were Jewish. So when we commemorate Kristallnacht, we also need to remember that hate begins with words, but if left unchecked, it does not end with words. Kristallnacht was the first mass attack on Jewish communities throughout German territory just because they were Jews. And the United States had the chance to aid the victims. Kristallnacht had made the danger incredibly clear. And yet we did not open to immigration. We can't wait until people are being murdered to try to stop a genocide. We need to pay attention when warning signs are present, and we can't hesitate to stand up to anti-Semitism and hate speech, no matter who is saying it. We know how most Americans responded to Kristallnacht, and we have to look to people who did take action, who did stand up, and we need to seek our inspiration from them today. So I once again want to thank you for listening to this lecture, and from my friends and colleagues at the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education for first inviting me to help with your Kristallnacht commemoration and then inviting me to make this recording. Thanks so much again.